The deadbolt slides home like a gunshot, echoing through the hollow silence of suburbia. I am standing on the cracked sidewalk clutching a single suitcase, my name. Harper Jennings, suddenly worth less than the designer wreath on the door. The sun glares off the windows of the home I built, but I feel only the biting chill of exile. I have $52 to my name and a heart fractured by the man who just discarded me like trash. Yet buried deep in my luggage inside the lining of a mechanic's old denim jacket waits a secret that is about to burn his world to the ground. Listen now to hear how I fought back. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home sounded like a gunshot. I stood on the cracked sidewalk outside the suburban Denver mini-mansion I had spent the last 5 years turning into a home, my fingers white-knuckling the handle of a single overstuffed suitcase. The late afternoon sun glared off the polished windows, but I felt nothing but a bone-deep chill. The door opened one last time, but not to let me back in. Mason stood there, filling the frame, looking at me with the same casual indifference he used when inspecting a shipment of lumber. He didn't look like a husband ending a marriage. He looked like a CEO firing a redundant temp. "The house, the cars, the accounts, they're in my name, Harper," he said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "You should have read what you signed. Honestly, you should be grateful I stuck around this long." Behind him, his sister Lila leaned against the doorframe. She was already reaching out to adjust a wreath on the wall, a wreath I had made by hand last Christmas. She smirked, her eyes raking over my disheveled hair and cheap coat. "Finally?" she murmured, loud enough for me to hear. "Deadweight Mason. That's all she was. A womb that didn't work, and a maid we didn't have to pay. Good riddance." The insults landed like physical blows, knocking the wind out of me. I wanted to scream that I had quit my graphic design career to manage the chaos of Mason's construction business. I wanted to list the hundreds of nights I spent doing the books until 3 in the morning for free, finding the tax loopholes that saved him thousands, playing the perfect hostess to his boorish clients, and swallowing every comment about how I was too emotional or not business-minded. I had poured myself into his life until there was nothing left of me, and now I was being disposed of like trash because he had finally made his millions and didn't need the starter wife anymore. Mason stepped out onto the porch and extended a hand. He wasn't offering help. He was handing me a thin white envelope. "Divorce decree is filed, and this," he said, flicking the corner of a check inside, "covers a month of rent. Somewhere modest. We're even now." He turned his back before I could speak, and the door slammed shut for good. 3 hours later, I was sitting on a bed that smelled of stale smoke and lemon cleaner. The neon sign of the highway motel flickered through the thin curtains, buzzing like a dying insect. I had paid cash for the week because I didn't trust my credit cards to work anymore. I counted the crumpled bills on the duvet, $52 and some change. That was it. That was the sum total of my life's work. Desperate for a lifeline, I dialed my mother's number. I needed to hear a familiar voice, someone to tell me this was a nightmare. But when Renee answered, her tone was icy. "Mason told me, Harper," she said, cutting off my sob. "He told me you drained the business accounts, that you were unstable. How could you do that to a man who gave you everything?" I froze, the phone slipping in my sweaty palm. "Mom, that's a lie. He took everything. I have nothing." "Don't lie to me," she snapped. "I raised you better than to be a greedy, vindictive woman. Don't call here until you're ready to apologize to him." The line went dead. I sat in the silence of that grimy room, the realization washing over me like cold water. Mason hadn't just taken my money. He had stolen my narrative. He had poisoned my own family against me. I was completely, utterly alone. It was 3:00 a.m. when the panic truly set in. I couldn't sleep, so I tore through my suitcase looking for anything I could pawn, a watch, a necklace, anything Mason had missed. My hands brushed against rough fabric at the bottom of the bag, an old denim jacket. It had belonged to my dad, Patrick Jennings. He was a quiet auto mechanic who died when I was 19, a man whose hands were always stained with grease and whose heart was bigger than his wallet. I pulled it out, burying my face in the collar, imagining I could still smell motor oil and peppermint. As I hugged the jacket, I felt a crinkle in the inner lining. I reached into the hidden pocket and pulled out a yellowed envelope. On the front, in Dad's blocky familiar handwriting, it read, "For Harper, when the world gets mean." Dad. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a battered debit card from Frontier State Bank, a small local bank I hadn't thought about in years, and a note on a piece of torn notebook paper. "Keep this safe. Use it only when you have no one else and nothing left. I love you more than you know." I stared at the card. I remembered finding this jacket years ago and dismissing the lump in the pocket, assuming it was just a $50 emergency fund he'd squirreled away. A knife twist of grief pierced through the numbness. He had nothing when he died, yet he tried to leave something for me. I debated shoving it back in the pocket. I hated needing help, especially from a ghost. But I looked at the $52 on the bed, then at the mold on the motel ceiling. "If there's even $20 on this, I'm going to make it count," I whispered to the empty room. The next morning, I walked up the hill toward the imposing stone facade of Frontier State Bank. I felt small and shabby in my wrinkled clothes, clutching that scratched piece of plastic like a weapon. My heart pounded against my ribs as I pushed through the heavy glass doors, thinking only of survival. I had no idea that the scratched little card in my hand was about to blow my entire life apart. The air inside Frontier State Bank smelled of expensive cologne and air conditioning, a sharp contrast to the stale motel room I'd just left. I stood in line, clutching the edges of my dad's denim jacket, acutely aware of how out of place I looked. Everyone else seemed to be wearing business casual or sharp suits, checking watches that cost more than my car. When I finally reached the teller window, I was greeted by Mr. Donnelly, a man with a calm, worn face and graying hair that suggested he'd seen everything this bank had to offer. I slid the battered, scratched debit card across the marble counter, my cheeks burning with shame. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, avoiding his eyes. "I know it's ancient. I just need to check if there's a balance. Even a few dollars." I expected him to laugh or tell me the account had been closed for inactivity a decade ago. Instead, he swiped it. He paused. He swiped it again, and then the color drained from his face so fast I thought he was having a stroke. His hands started to shake. Before I could ask if he was okay, he pressed a button under the counter. 2 uniformed security guards materialized near the lobby entrance. Panic seized my throat. Had Dad done something illegal? Had Mason set me up to walk into a trap? "Ms. Jennings," Mr. Donnelly said, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, step into my private office, immediately." I followed him, legs feeling like lead, convinced I was about to be arrested. But once the heavy oak door clicked shut, the tone shifted. Mr. Donnelly verified my identity with trembling efficiency, then turned his monitor toward me. "I don't think you understand what your father did, Harper." I looked at the screen. I blinked, sure I was misreading the digits. It wasn't $50. It wasn't $5,000. It was a trust in my name, untouched, with an 8-figure balance. Tens of millions of dollars. The room spun. Mr. Donnelly explained that years ago my father had inherited a worthless patch of industrial wasteland from an uncle. A developer wanted to buy it for peanuts, but Dad refused the buyout. Instead, he negotiated a 5% lifetime profit share of whatever was built there. That wasteland became High Ridge Tech Park, a behemoth corporate campus housing some of the biggest tech giants in the country. For 2 decades, while we scraped by on mechanics' wages and generic groceries, checks had been quietly depositing into this trust, locked tight until I needed it. I felt a wave of dizzy disbelief, followed by a surge of grief and anger. Why had he kept us poor? Why had he let me struggle? "There is something else," Mr. Donnelly said, his voice grave. "There is a security alert on the account. 3 months ago, someone using your social security number attempted to gain access to any accounts in your name. The system flagged it as suspicious because the trust requires biometric verification, which they didn't have." My stomach twisted into a knot. 3 months ago was exactly when Mason had started coming home late when he became distant and cold, right before he blindsided me with the divorce. He knew. You need protection, Donnelly said, sliding a business card across the desk. Ava Price. She's the best trust and estates lawyer in the city. Call her now. An hour later, I was sitting in a sleek, glass-walled office downtown. Ava Price was terrifyingly impressive, calm, surgical, and sharp as a scalpel. I laid it all out for her, the controlling marriage, Mason forcing me to sign business paperwork. I didn't understand the insults about me being dead weight and how he had isolated me from everyone. Ava didn't offer pity. She offered action. She immediately ordered a full forensic review of the divorce filings, Mason's business records, and any public property data related to Patrick Jennings. The results came back faster than I expected, and they were horrific. Over the next few days, Ava's team uncovered the depth of the betrayal. Mason hadn't just fallen out of love, he had hunted me. He had hired a private investigator to track any hidden inheritance connected to my father. He found the profit share deal but couldn't locate the trust itself. Realizing I was sitting on a gold mine I didn't know about, he tried to steal it. When he couldn't access the money, he forged my digital signature on documents to transfer our joint assets into his name and discarded me. But it got worse. Ava's investigators found that Mason's construction company, Coal Ridge Developments, was rotting from the inside out. To fund his lifestyle and pay off gambling debts, he had been cutting corners, hiding major structural defects, bribing inspectors, and knowingly selling unsafe homes to working-class families in my hometown. I felt sick, furious, and violated. The betrayal wasn't just marital anymore. It was criminal. He was hurting innocent people. Ava leaned forward, her expression serious. Harper, this trust is irrevocable. He has zero legal claim to it. You have the power now. You can take this money, disappear, and live a life of luxury. You can rebuild quietly. Or... She paused, gauging me. We use the truth to take him down. I thought about the motel room. I thought about the way he looked at me on the porch. Then I thought about the families living in houses that might collapse on them. I looked Ava in the eye, shaking but resolute. If he was willing to throw me into the street, what's he willing to do to people he's never met? I said, my voice steadying. We're not just fighting for me anymore. We're fighting for them. Ava's plan was not a brawl. It was a surgical dismantling. Sitting in her war room, surrounded by forensic accountants and stacks of files, she laid out a strategy that felt more like a grandmaster's chess game than a revenge plot. We weren't going to slash tires or send angry texts. Instead, we used a slice of the trust to retain the best financial investigators in the state. We quietly began buying up Mason's outstanding business debt through shell entities, acquiring the loans he had leveraged to keep his house of cards standing. Ava suggested leaking a story to the press immediately, but I refused. No smear campaigns, I said, staring at the whiteboard covered in Mason's financial web. I don't want rumors. I want provable facts. If I do this, I'm not becoming him. But while I was building a case based on truth, Mason was busy spinning lies. My phone buzzed with a call from my mother, Renee. I answered, hoping for an apology, but was met with hysteria. I heard what you did, she sobbed. Mason told me everything. He said you stole Patrick's money, that you've been hiding it for years, and now you're trying to destroy his business out of spite. I felt the blood drain from my face. Mason and Lila hadn't just stolen my past. They were actively poisoning my reputation. Mom, he's lying. I pleaded, but she cut me off. Don't you drag this family name through the mud, Harper. Be a good person for once. The betrayal was a physical ache in my chest. The man who discarded me had convinced my own mother to discard me too. I took a breath, my voice trembling but firm. Mom, I love you, but I am done letting you choose my abuser over me. I hung up, knowing I had likely just severed the last tie to my old life. Fueled by that heartbreak, I threw myself into the investigation. Ava's team and I went out to meet the people living in Coal Ridge homes. It was one thing to see numbers on a spreadsheet. It was another to stand in a single mother's child's bedroom and look at a ceiling that had collapsed onto a crib, just hours after the baby was moved. We met an older couple who had sunk their entire retirement into a forever home that was now shifting on a cracked foundation. We sat with a veteran who developed chronic lung issues because Mason had ordered his crews to paint over black mold rather than remediate it. Listening to their stories, seeing the fear and powerlessness in their eyes that mirrored my own, my sadness calcified into white-hot outrage. If I have to burn every dollar my father left me to make this right, I promised myself as we drove away, I will. The hammer dropped on a Tuesday morning. Armed with the evidence, Ava's team had compiled internal emails, forged safety reports, and witness testimonies. State regulators raided the Coal Ridge offices. I watched from a parked car across the street, my heart hammering against my ribs as agents carried out boxes of files and computers. The news cycle erupted instantly. Local anchors who used to praise Mason as a pillar of the community were now listing alleged frauds. The narrative began to flip. I wasn't the crazy ex-wife anymore. I was the whistleblower. But Mason didn't go down quietly. He went on the evening news, tears in his eyes, snarling that I was a vindictive gold digger and crying about how family was being torn apart by my greed. The final confrontation happened in the sterile hallway of the courthouse before the regulatory hearing. Mason cornered me near the elevators, his face a mask of red-hot fury. He tried to physically block my path, looming over me just like he had in our doorway. "You owe me," he hissed, spittle flying. "We built this together. Half that money is mine morally, if not legally. You think you can ruin me?" I looked at him, and for the first time I didn't see a giant. I saw a small, scared bully. "You threw me into the street, Mason," I said, my voice shaking but steady. "You lied to my family. You sold dangerous homes to people who trusted you. This isn't revenge, it's accountability." Inside the hearing room, the air was thick with tension. The testimony was damning. Inspectors admitted to taking bribes, and families wept as they described their ruined homes. Then Ava played her ace. She revealed the financial restructuring we had executed in the shadows. She presented documents showing that the loans keeping Coal Ridge developments afloat, millions in construction debt, had been purchased by a private entity. Mason looked confused until Ava clarified that the entity was mine. "The loans are being called in effective immediately," Ava stated coolly. Mason froze. He looked from the judge to the paperwork and finally to me. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The ex-wife he tried to erase, the woman he called dead weight, now held the mortgage on his entire existence. He had absolutely no leverage left. The room fell silent as the judge reviewed the documents. Ava turned to me, her expression unreadable but expectant. The regulators and the judge were waiting for my move. Ava leaned in and whispered, "We have him. You can foreclose right now and crush him completely, or you can choose another way." My heart pounded as I thought of my father's patched boots, his quiet ethics, and the power I now held in my hands. The room held its breath, the silence stretching until it hummed in my ears. I looked at Mason sweating in his expensive suit, and then at the families sitting behind him, the people whose lives he had leveraged for his own comfort. In that moment, the temptation to crush him, to take his assets and flaunt my victory was intoxicating. But then I looked at my father's name on the trust documents. Patrick Jennings hadn't left me this money to become another tyrant. I stood up, smoothing my skirt, and made the choice that would define the rest of my life. I announced to the court that I would not be seizing Coal Ridge developments for personal profit. Instead, I ordered the immediate liquidation of the company and all its assets, directing every single penny of the proceeds into a restitution fund for the homeowners Mason had defrauded. A gasp rippled through the room. Mason stared at me, his jaw slack. He had expected me to be greedy because that's what he would have done. By refusing to profit from his destruction, I stripped him of his last defense. I wasn't the bitter ex-wife stealing his company. I was the hand of justice he couldn't bribe. The victory, however, didn't feel like a parade. In the days following the hearing, the fallout was messy and loud. While the news outlets began to paint the true picture of Mason's fraud, the internet remained a cesspool of misogyny. Anonymous commenters called me a homewrecker and an attention seeker, claiming I had planned this coup from the start. One morning, I walked out of my motel room to find the word traitor spray-painted in jagged red letters across my door. It shook me, reminding me that the truth rarely protects you from hatred. But for every act of malice, there was a quiet act of grace. The families I had fought for began to show up. One woman brought me a tin of homemade cookies. Another sent a handwritten letter thanking me because her children could finally sleep safely without fear of the roof caving in. Buoyed by their support, I finally checked out of the motel. I didn't buy a mansion to replace the one Mason kicked me out of. Instead, I rented a simple, sunny apartment downtown. It had hardwood floors and drafty windows, but I paid the rent from the trust with a sense of immense satisfaction. It wasn't a flex, it was a fresh start. With the immediate legal battles settling, I turned my attention to the future. I used the trust to establish the second-story foundation, a name I chose to honor both the houses we were fixing and the new chapters we were writing. The mission was specific to provide emergency rent grants, legal aid, and construction inspections for people, especially women who had been financially and emotionally gutted by family betrayal or corporate abuse. I hired a small staff prioritizing locals and people who had survived similar situations. Walking into that office, hearing the phones ring with people offering help rather than demanding payment, I felt a sense of purpose I had never known in my marriage. I was grounded, useful, and free, though the silence of my own family still haunted me. That silence broke a week later, when my mother Renee pounded on my apartment door. She didn't hug me. She stormed past me into the living room, her face tight with judgment. She accused me of dragging my father's name through the courts and ruining Mason's life. "You need to be the bigger person, Harper," she demanded, her voice shrill. "Help him rebuild. Show everyone you're not vindictive." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she was more afraid of scandal than she was protective of her daughter. I finally said the words I had swallowed for 30 years. "You love the version of me who stayed quiet and easy to blame, Mom. That woman is gone." I didn't scream. I didn't slam the door. I just opened it and waited. She stared at me, shocked by my resolve, and then walked out without looking back. It was a funeral for a relationship that had died years ago, a mix of deep mourning and intoxicating liberation. The next morning, I drove to the modest cemetery on the edge of town. I wore work boots and a simple jacket, looking more like Patrick Jennings' daughter than I ever had before. I stood over his grave, the grass wet with dew. I talked to him for a long time. I admitted I was angry he had kept the money a secret, that he had let us struggle when he could have fixed it. But then I thanked him. I thanked him for trusting my character more than my circumstances, for knowing I would need a lifeline eventually. I told him about the families we were helping, the raid and the foundation. I felt a deep catharsis, tears streaming down my face, but they weren't tears of despair. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed. It was Ava. "Harper," she said, her voice serious. "The district attorney's office just called. They're moving forward with criminal charges against Mason and Lila. Are you ready for what comes next?" 9 months later. I woke up to the sound of a cheap coffee maker burbling in the kitchen and the sight of dust motes dancing in a shaft of sunlight on bare hardwood floors. There was no marble island, no radiant floor heating, and no looming sense of dread. My apartment was modest, a third-floor walk-up with creaky pipes, but every inch of it belonged to me. I owned my time, I owned my work, and for the first time in a decade, I owned my own story. The quiet contentment I felt sipping my coffee out of a mismatched mug was worth more than every luxury car Mason had ever parked in our driveway. The hollow glamour of that life had been stripped away, leaving something far more durable in its place. Mason's world, by contrast, had completely dismantled. The news reports had become background noise to my new life, but I still caught the headlines. The district attorney had formally charged both Mason and Lila with multiple counts of fraud, falsifying inspections, and reckless endangerment. Coal Ridge Developments was legally defunct, its assets carved up and sold off to pay the restitution checks that were finally hitting the mailboxes of the families he had cheated. I didn't feel the urge to gloat. The reality of his fall hit me on a Tuesday afternoon when I ran into a big box hardware store for supplies. I turned an aisle and froze. Their stocking shelves with lumber was Mason. He looked 10 years older, his face gaunt and angry, the arrogance replaced by a hollow, bitter exhaustion. He saw me, and for a second his eyes locked with mine. There was no fight left in him, just a flicker of resentful recognition. I didn't say a word. I didn't feel a spike of fear or a pang of longing. I just felt nothing. It was the ultimate closure. He was just a ghost of a bad memory fading into the background of a life he could no longer touch. My focus had shifted entirely to the ripple effect of the truth. The Second Story Foundation was no longer just an idea on paper. It was a force in the community. We were in full swing, operating out of a small storefront that buzzed with activity. In the last month alone, we had secured emergency grants to keep 3 families from eviction, forced a notorious slumlord to bring his buildings up to code, and helped a young single father restructure a predatory loan that was drowning him. I spent my afternoons meeting with local community leaders, setting up partnerships with legal clinics, and teaching financial literacy workshops, specifically for women leaving toxic relationships. We talked about resilience, about the power of community, and about the personal freedom that comes from knowing your rights. The proudest moment, however, came during the inaugural ceremony for the Harper Jennings Trades and Tech Scholarship. I had set it up to honor my dad funding education for kids from working-class families who wanted to build things with their hands just like he did. The room was filled with parents in thrift store best clothes, beaming with a pride that lit up the room. I stood on the small stage and handed the first award to a young woman named Elena. She had grease under her fingernails and calloused hands from working part-time in her father's garage. When she took the certificate, she looked me in the eye and said, "I won't waste this. I'm going to help people like us." In her fierce determination, I saw my father's stubborn hope living on, finally given the oxygen it deserved. That night, I stood on my balcony looking out at the scattered lights of Denver. The city air was crisp, and the noise of the streets below felt like a heartbeat. I thought about the woman who had stood on that sidewalk less than a year ago, shaking ashamed, holding one suitcase, convinced her life was over. I realized then that revenge hadn't healed me. Watching Mason fall was justice, yes, but it wasn't the cure. The healing came from responsibility, from setting boundaries, and from finding a purpose that was bigger than my own pain. I acknowledged the sorrow of the losses, my mother, my marriage, the illusions of safety I used to cherish, but I also felt the triumph of surviving the fire and forging something unbreakable in the ashes. My phone buzzed on the railing. It was a text from a new intake case for the foundation. The message was from a woman I hadn't met yet. It read, "My husband handles all the money. He makes all the decisions. I don't know where to start. I just know I can't live like this anymore." I picked up the phone, my thumbs moving quickly over the screen. "You just started," I typed. "We've got you." I went back inside and opened my laptop. The screen glowed, illuminating a spreadsheet of expansion plans for the foundation. In the reflection of the glass, I caught a glimpse of my own face. It was no longer the haunted, fearful face of a victim. It was steady. It was fierce. I closed the lid with a soft click, knowing the truth. The best revenge wasn't ruining Mason Cole. It was becoming someone he and people like him could never own, never silence, and never break again. Harper found her voice, proving that rock bottom can be the solid foundation needed to rebuild. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and resilience, please hit that subscribe button to support the channel. What would you have done in Harper's position with that trust fund? Let us know below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.